Hello and welcome to September's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live. Today we are talking about building inclusive talent pipelines. We're asking a bit of an awkward question. Are women's development programs maybe a thing of the past? Have they had their day? I'm Rachel Schofield. I'm delighted to be joined by Sharon Peake, founder and CEO of Shape Talent. Hi there, Sharon.
Hello, great to be here, Rachel.
Good to have you with us. I'll do a proper introduction to Sharon in a moment, but we always like to know who we're talking to. So introduce yourselves by all means in the chat, in the comments. Tell us who you are, say hello, maybe let us know where you're joining from. But as I say, our guest today, Sharon, is a global expert in leadership, diversity and talent acceleration. She has decades of experience helping organizations to design inclusive strategies that are going to deliver measurable impact. She's worked with some of the world's leading businesses to close the gender leadership gap. And at Shape Talent, she partners with organizations to build inclusive, future fit talent pipelines. It's all about what works and what works going forward in today's environment. So she's been designing and delivering women's development programs for many years. And I think it's fair to say has seen both the power and the potential pitfalls of these programs. So today I'm going to be getting curious with Sharon and asking, are women's development programs outdated? Maybe they're ripe for reinvention. What really works if you want to accelerate diverse talent in a sustainable way? So we're going to really dig into this, aren't we, Sharon? And I'm going to start by asking you the big question, really, which is, are they still relevant? Are they still something we should be thinking about? Because, of course, we have seen lots of movement. There's, of course, a bit of pushback from the anti-woke movement. Companies, as often happens, there are cycles where budgetary pressure becomes a serious thing. There's maybe a sense in some quarters that, well, haven't we kind of done women's programs? So are they still fit for purpose, or do they need some kind of reinvention, do you think?
Well, thank you, Rachel. It's a really fair question to ask, of course, for all the reasons you said. Women's development programs have been around for a very long time. They've been around for decades, and people sometimes have quite strong feelings about them and their relevance. So if we zoom out for a moment and look at this from a macro perspective, there has been progress in women's representation over the last few decades, and that's usually one of the things that women's development programs are there to address. But more recently, women's representation in leadership has stalled the world over. And sadly, in some cases, it's going backwards. So the global gender gap is worsening, sadly. So I do think interventions like this are still very much needed. Now, the problem with many women's development programs is that they risk trying to fix the women rather than fix the system. Often these programs were designed in an era, a different era, and without a real understanding of some of the gender dynamics that play out for women in the workplace. So let me give you a simple example of that. There is conventional wisdom that most of our listeners will have heard before, which is, that basically women just need to speak up and ask for what they want. They need to assert themselves to get their needs met. But actually, when you look at the research, women are penalised when they do this. Anytime a woman transgresses those gender stereotypes, such as acting a little bit more assertively like that, there is a social penalty. So that approach doesn't work for women. So you've got to have programs that design with women in mind and the systemic barriers in mind. So you need programs that help women step into leadership in a way that is authentic for them without any judgment from the system. And at the same time, you've got to be shining a light on the systemic barriers that are going to be there in the organization. You've got to shine a light on those. And often these programs can act as a mirror. They can help highlight what some of those systemic barriers are. So are programs like this outdated, women's development programs outdated? Well, I don't think so if they're designed with intent, they're designed with a systemic focus.
And I guess the other thing they need to be designed to do is to be effective. And I'm, if you're the person who's forking out for this, if you really want to bring about proper change, you want to know, are these programs working?
Yeah, it's really important to look at whether women's development programs actually work, of course. Our data says yes. So we've had over 1,200 women go through our programs, and we measure the outcomes. And for organizations, any organizations listening, we would strongly encourage you to measure the outcomes here. But one of the key indicators that organizations often look at is how many women are promoted past the program. Are women staying? So in our statistics, our data set, we know that women are twice as likely to be promoted if they've gone through a program like this, and they're twice as likely to stay with the organization. So kind of, to my mind, they are a proven accelerator when they're designed and executed well.
And if we go below the surface, why do they work? What is it that's happening that makes a difference?
Yeah. So, in our work, of course, we truly believe in the power of women's development programs. And let me give you a couple of reasons why they work. So, first of all, leadership isn't just a job title, it's an identity shift. And for women, that shift looks different. So these programs create the space where women can build a leadership identity that is authentic for them and not just a carbon copy of what everyone else is doing, which is so often the case in many organizations. Women feel that that's what they need to aspire to. So first of all, leadership isn't a job title, it's an identity shift. Secondly, we know that when you get women-only groups, the conversations go deeper, faster. So we run both women-only programs. We also run mixed gender programs. And so we know this. We've seen this ourselves. But also there is research out there that says that 70% of women say they're more likely to speak up about their career challenges if they're in a women-only forum. So we know they give faster results. And then the third thing I would say is that the impact goes beyond the individual. So of course you're going to impact the women in the cohort, but these programs, as I said earlier, act as a mirror for what's going on in the organization, revealing some of the systemic barriers that still need tackling. So there's several reasons why I think gender-specific programs are such powerful accelerators.
Yeah, and that second point about women-only groups, that really resonates with me as someone who facilitates small group coaching and has worked in mixed gender groups and women-only. Yeah, faster, deeper, quicker, really reveals some interesting stuff. But I digress. So if a company is thinking about planning a women's development program, what are some of the things they really need to keep front of mind?
So there's a couple of things that come to mind. The Women's Development Program cannot be the only solution. So I've talked about there being systemic barriers. We know that from our own research, most of the barriers that stop women being represented equally in leadership are systemic. They're not to do with the individual. They're not things that the individual alone can fix. So it can't be the only solution. It's got to be part of a suite of solutions, I think, is the first point. Our programs typically incorporate some kind of systemic work. And for anyone thinking of designing their own women's development program, or maybe you've got one running at the moment and you're thinking of how you might enhance it, make sure that you're addressing some of the systemic barriers, I think is a really important thing to bear in mind. So things like access to sponsorship, access to networks, raising visibility with senior leaders, that kind of stuff. You need to make sure the program is designing for that. The other thing that I think organizations need to think about is the current climate. So you alluded to this in the introduction. The current climate is not very favorable to EDI, DEI generally at the moment, or to gender equity. There's a growing fatigue around gender equity. So it means there can be pushback within organizations. People are feeling a bit more emboldened to speak up and to resist and to complain and to say, well, what about me? So more than ever, you need to think about your positioning of this. You need to think about the business case, and you need to think about the human case for this as well, and make sure that you position it well before you launch. We've seen organizations in the past fall over at the first hurdle because they've had a brilliantly designed program, but they haven't positioned it well, and it's led to a bit of backlash. So you've got to also think about the positioning and the buy-in, and make sure you explain to people why you're doing it, and that people aren't being left behind, men aren't being left behind in the process.
Yeah, I want to pick up on, you used the word climate, and of course the environment is such, particularly in the States, that we know some companies are feeling, I guess, the geopolitical pressure to row back from women-only development programs. So in the US, of course, Trump's anti-DEI executive orders back earlier this year, relevant to organizations which are US federal contractors. So if people are thinking, well, we still want to have a focus on gender equity, but legally, how much room to maneuver do we have? What can we do and still make sure we're adhering to what's been put in front of us? What would your advice be to them?
Okay, well, let's start with a bit of context for anyone who's not operating in the US. In January, President Trump announced some executive orders, some anti-DEI executive orders that did have a ripple effect around the world. There were two primary executive orders. One impacted federal agencies in the US, the other impacted companies who were federal contractors to the US government. And basically, the executive orders prohibited those organizations from offering any DEI programs. So what those exec orders didn't do, there was one that tried to influence the private sector, but there's a limit as to how much government can impact the private sector. So what these executive orders don't do is they don't impact most private companies unless you are a US federal contractor. Of course, some organizations based in Europe or the UK are, but unless you're a federal contractor, they really don't impact you. And by the way, it's worth noting these exec orders are being fought in the courts at the moment, so we still don't know how the judicial system is going to find on whether they're valid or not. They're being challenged in multiple jurisdictions right now. In Europe, at least, we are starting to see a bit of normality. There was a bit of a pause for a while after the executive orders. Multinational companies didn't know what to do. They kind of consulted with their legal teams. Nothing happened for a good 6 months, but we're starting to see a bit more of a return to normality in Europe right now. Companies, doing what they would ordinarily do, following their plans, following their values, which is great. We have a number of clients who are European headquarters who are US federal contractors. And so, they've had to make some changes. Some have scaled back programs, some have rebadged them, some are implementing different approaches in the US to the rest of the world. So different companies have taken different decisions here. I guess my point is it's less about whether companies legally can run women's development programs, because certainly in Europe, they're absolutely allowed, possible. They're deemed positive action programs, which widely is encouraged in European legislation. So it's not whether they can do it legally, it's whether they want to do it or not, that really is the question.
So if a company is feeling a little bit twitchy, there are ways then to be a bit, I suppose, creative, or to think a little bit outside the box and continue running these programs, but be a bit smart about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some organizations are getting nervous and twitchy about running women's development programs, but there are smart ways of doing it that are legally compliant. So let me outline a couple of different approaches that we've seen work. So one approach, and we do this with some clients, is to run a mixed gender program, is to open it up to people of all genders, men, women, non-binary, trans community as well. And to do that using inclusive design. So when you design a program that is intended to address the barriers of those who face the biggest hurdles, then you don't just lift them up, you lift everyone up. So you can design a program that works for everyone, but still has the intended, still reaches the intended outcome. So that's one option, make them mixed gendered. The other option is to keep them women focused, call them a women's development program, but open it up to an application process and open it up to everyone of all genders. So allow men to apply. You might want to say in this application process that it's a women's development program. You might want to ask, as one of your questions, what interest does the applicant have in accelerating women's development, in removing barriers that women face. So you might get everyone to answer that question. But there might be some men who, for personal reasons, agree with that really strongly, feel that's really important, will be strong supporters. that could be appropriate to include in the program. So we've seen organizations do that as well. Mm-hmm. So you might end up with a few men in the program. You also, whatever your approach, you have to also consider what you do with the trans and non-binary community as well. So you've got to be a little bit careful here about not being too binary around gender. We always encourage our clients to include trans women in our women's development programs, but also non-binary employees as well, because these communities often face similar barriers to women in their career progression. So the benefits, the design, which is based around women, will have applicability certainly to the trans community and non-binary community as well. So you just need to think about the language you use in your positioning so that you are making sure your programs are inclusive. So there isn't just one way forward. With the right design, you can tailor your programs to meet women's needs while bringing the organisation along at the same time.
So interesting. It's a shame we can't see everybody. I always sense there must be people there taking a lot of notes when you talk. It's so helpful. And on that note, let me just say that towards the end of the half hour, we will make time for questions. So if you want to go deeper with Sharon on something, if something throws up a question for you, then put it in the comments and I will make some time for that towards the end of the session. We've got lots to pack in though. So let's get a bit granular next, Sharon, and think about what good looks like. So if organizations want to future-proof their pipelines, that's the magic word that we're talking about today, what needs to be in place?
Yeah, there's some really important things to think about in getting women's development programs right. And they kind of fall into two buckets. One is your strategic objectives and the positioning of the program. So how does this fit in with your HR strategy, your overall DEI, EDI strategy? Kind of what role does it play in the overall strategy, and how does that support the business strategy? And then the second bucket is the design and the content of the program. So let's start with your strategic objectives and the positioning of a women's development program. So it starts with needing clarity of purpose. So what is the problem you are trying to solve? Is it leadership representation? Is it strength of talent pipeline, number of women in your talent pipeline? Is it retention of women? Is it engagement of women? So depending on your objectives, whatever your objective is might lend itself to a different intervention. So be really clear on what is the problem you are trying to solve. And then think about how you're going to measure success. So many of our clients do a women's development program because they're trying to strengthen their pipeline, get more women into leadership, and maybe also retain women. So, common metrics that you might use for that are things like number of promotions, in 12 months' time, so not just after the program, but 6-12 months later longitudinally, representation longitudinally, retention, labor turnover retention longitudinally. As I said before, in the programs we've run, we've seen our clients get extraordinary results. Women twice as likely to be promoted, twice as likely to stay. One client had 71% of their participants promoted within 12 months of the program. So be very clear on the clarity of purpose. The second thing is you need to think about how you're going to secure buy-in. So this is a step that's often overlooked, and it's so important. If you don't do this properly, the whole thing can lose support. You need to know that the programs are well positioned in the organisation, that your executive committee understand why you're running them and will support them. And when I say executive committee, this is really important because often in a well-designed women's development program, you will want to include some level of sponsorship. You will want to engage senior leaders, senior executives in the program quite actively. Now, if they don't buy into it, they're not going to be delivering the right messages and they're not going to be supporting it in the right way. And that's a critical element to its success. So make sure you've got buy-in from the very top. That might also include your board. But equally important is tackling the systemic side. So, a program alone, women's development program alone, won't solve bias in promotion processes or a culture of microaggressions and discrimination or a lack of inclusive leadership. So it might be one part of the puzzle. Then there will most likely be other things that you want to do in parallel with this. It's just one part of the solution.
Yeah. And I'm reflecting as you're talking, sorry, about the idea that different organizations look different and have different challenges around gender equity. So I guess this kind of idea that there's a cookie cutter model is really not going to work. There's quite a lot of thinking and talking and investigating that needs to be done first.
Yeah, thank you. It's so important that a one size fits all program is not something that's going to work. So if I get to the kind of the second key area here, it's about the design and the content of the program. And so there's 4 things that I think organizations need to think about when you're designing a program, women's development program. The first is it tailored to the specific barriers that women face in your organization? So that begs the question, do you know what those barriers are? Is it line managers aren't giving specific enough career development feedback to encourage women? Is it that they're not nurturing ambition? Is it that there is bias in the performance review process? What is going on in the organization? So the program needs to address the specific barriers. So you need to start with an understanding of what they are. The second thing is the program needs to then help women to navigate those barriers. So it's got to do what it says on the lid. And this isn't about fixing women. It's about giving them strategies and tools to navigate a system that in most cases wasn't designed for them, while the systemic barriers are being dismantled in parallel. You've got to do both at the same time. The third thing is you've got to create a safe environment that is also stretching for the women in the program. So, you've got to give them the space to develop their authentic leadership style, to do that in an environment that is free of judgment, and to explore what that means. So it's got to be stretching, but it's also got to be a safe environment. So the facilitation of these sessions is really, really important. And then the fourth point that's really important in your design is you've got to build visibility and sponsorship of the women in the program. So helping women to access sponsorship, helping them to access high-powered networks is a really important part of a well-designed program. So often in our programs, we'll run a sponsorship program in parallel with some of the more programmatic elements of the program to help, and then we will help women to make the most of those visibility opportunities. So if I was to sum up, I think a good program probably does 4 things. It's strategically relevant, it's got buy-in from the top, it addresses the systemic barriers as one part of an overall solution, and it's tailored to the specific needs of the organization.
Brilliant. I'm keeping an eye on time. Don't forget, if you have a question for Sharon, drop it in now. You snooze, you lose. We said we would finish at 10:30. It might go a little bit over, but just briefly, one question I just wanted to ask you about tailoring, digging into what you were saying. Why does context matter so much?
Yeah, context is super important because every organization is different. Different sectors, different cultures, different career stages of the women going through the program all create different needs. So you've got to take into account your context and what your needs are. So for example, we work with some organizations who are very mature in their gender equity approach. They've been doing it for years. They've got multiple interventions happening. There's a language and executive committee that is familiar with this, that is supportive of this. Then we work with organizations, particularly in STEM dominated or STEM heavy industries, where they might be at the starting blocks here. It might be one of the first things they're doing. There's no language about it. There's no familiarity in the organization. And in those organizations, there's likely to be a bit more resistance. So you need to take into account that context particularly when you're positioning a program, but also when you're thinking about what your objectives are for a program. So getting back to the root causes of what's getting in the way for women in your business is a really important starting point, and then looking at how ready the organization is to manage those will help you with the design. There's one other point of context that is super, super important here, and that is about intersectionality. You need to apply an intersectional lens to the design and delivery of a women's development program for it to be effective. Not all women have the same experience. Not all women have the same lived experience. Me as a white, cis, heterosexual woman is going to have a very different experience from someone of a minoritized ethnicity, someone with a disability, someone in the LGBTQ community, for example. So you need to make sure that your design and your delivery is able to address the different needs of different intersections. It's super, super important. And let me give you a really practical example of this point. Often an assertive man in our stereotypical world is seen as a natural leader, whereas an assertive woman is seen as bossy, but an assertive Black woman is seen as angry. So you need to make sure that the delivery team understand these nuances in order to make sure that you have the most impact that you can and that you're not inadvertently leaving anyone behind as you're lifting people together.
Yeah. I have one more question. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. I think there are some tech problems that a few people are having, so that makes me think that there may be people who have questions and they can't get in the chat. If you watch this on replay, we keep getting active in the chat. So if you've got questions for Sharon and you're not being able to get them in today at this very moment, don't worry, we will pick them up. You're always welcome to connect with us. So last question from me, Sharon, which is coming back full circle. We said this is all about pipelines. These programs don't exist as a kind of, well, this would be a nice thing to do. They have an impact, they have a mission to really kind of create sustainable pipelines. So how do we really move to lasting change, make it stick from the good intentions of this would be a nice thing to do to actually lasting change?
Yeah, that's such an important question, because these programs can be a relatively high investment. So if you don't get lasting change, you've got to ask yourself why bother? And there are ways of getting lasting change. So there's a few things that I would encourage people to think about. The first thing is to switch your focus from programs or initiatives to pipeline building. So if that's your objective, to build more women in your talent pipeline and ultimately more women in leadership roles, then stop thinking about this as a one-off program and start thinking about it as a multi-year strategic pipeline building objective, of which this will be one of several solutions. So integrate it into your talent management and EDI plans. That's really, really important. As I said before, this should be one part of the puzzle. It shouldn't be the whole puzzle. The second thing I would say is you need accountability from senior leaders. I talked about this a moment ago, and not just HR. Often we have, super enthusiastic HR sponsors, but the exco isn't always fully on board, or some are, some aren't. If your exco isn't on board, then you might want to wait until you've got their support, because the program impact will be limited if you don't have their support. So you need people in senior roles who act as sponsors. You need line managers who are going to be really engaged to really embed this program and make sure it's as effective as possible. So make sure you've got that on board to ensure you get that sustained change. It's not unusual to have a level of resistance from within organizations, and that, particularly in the geopolitical climate that we talked about earlier, that's very current and very topical at the moment. So, you might still get some eye rolls when you talk about a women's development program. In order to manage that well, you need to bring along everyone with you. So you need to have communications within the organization that explain why this is important, why this is one part of the EDI strategy, and how you are also including and supporting other genders, so particularly men. That's got to be a really explicit part of the communication. And then the other thing I would say to get the sustained impact is you've got to measure. You've always got to start with a clear objective. You need to measure whether you're delivering on that objective, and then you make refinements and adjustments as you go. So start with your objectives. Is it promotions? Is it representation? Is it engagement? Is it retention? And then look at how you measure that. Normally, it will be a longitudinal measure. You'll do your happy sheets along the way, making sure participants are getting value from the program. But actually, the real results are whether or not women are staying, whether they're getting promoted, whether they're more engaged, whatever your objective is. So make sure you've got some measures in place, a mix ideally of qualitative and quantitative to measure that, and then refine as you go. Make those tweaks as you go to make sure it keeps getting better and better and better and more impactful as you go.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I guess really keeping everybody in the loop. I remember earlier on you were talking about communicating and making sure everybody feels like they know what we're doing, we know why we're doing it, and everybody has an interest in seeing what happens as a result.
Yeah, indeed. It's communicating early in the positioning, but it's also communicating once you're getting results to keep people updated as to why you're still doing the program. We've got one client we've been working with for about 5 years now, delivering women's development programs, multinational, with a large employee population. They've done such a good job of communicating that there is always a wait list for the program. They've done an exceptional job of communicating. Sponsors want to be sponsors again. They do it once, they want to sign up for the next program. Line managers are familiar with the programs. So communication is really key to embedding it and making sure you get the outcomes that you want.
Yeah. Sharon, thank you so much. I know that there have been a few people who had some connection issues. We think it might be a LinkedIn issue. So hence, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat where normally there would be some. So let me reiterate that we are delighted to answer questions. Sharon will keep her eye on this. Do connect with her, get involved in the chat. However late you are watching this, we are always happy to answer any questions that come up. And if you are thinking, actually, I do want my organization to future-proof their pipeline, to think about really seriously about a women's development program that works, that's going to have an impact, that addresses all of those issues that Sharon was talking about, then by all means, let's have a call. So we offer a free diagnostic call. It will be with Sharon or another member of the team. There'll be a link in the comments that you can click on to book that in. So we're always delighted to have an initial chat and see whether it might be a great fit for your organization. What else do I need to tell you? Next month, we do these Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Lives monthly. So for your diary, the 15th of October at 10 a.m, we will be talking about menopause at work. It's Menopause Awareness Month in October. So we are rethinking support, policy and culture. And Sharon there mentioned a client of ours. Another client is providing 2 brilliant guests to join a member of our team for that discussion in October. It's Beiersdorf. Beiersdorf is a multinational company that manufactures personal care products. We've been working with them for some time, and 2 members of their team will be there to talk about what they've been doing, their policy and practices, the awareness raising that they've done around menopause. Really thoughtfully done at Beiersdorf, and we'll be digging in. It's always fascinating to see what other people are doing. We learn so much. So do join us for that. Keep the conversation going. And one other thing I wanted to say, we have a free resource for you, which I know you've been heavily involved in, Sharon. This is a playbook that you can download on the 20 ways. Sharon's touched on some of them, but 20 ways to accelerate talent. So if that's something you're interested in, if your objective is to strengthen your talent pipeline, then again, in the comments, we will drop the link so that you can access that playbook and start to really think about putting into place some great strategies for your organization. So all that remains for me to say is thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in October. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.